Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Jackie Raw, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Nelson Mandela University. This afternoon, my presentation for the WRC Symposium is on climate change mitigation and adaptation solutions from blue carbon ecosystems. So what is blue carbon? Blue carbon is the carbon that is stored in coastal and marine ecosystems, specifically within mangroves, salt marshes, and seagrasses. These ecosystems sequester and store large quantities of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which is then locked into the plants and the sediment. If this is left intact, the carbon can be locked up in this way for centuries. Blue carbon ecosystems can store more carbon per unit area than terrestrial forests. This is because up to 90% of the carbon stored in these ecosystems is within the soil, and this can be retained for much longer time periods than in terrestrial forests. If we take a look at the lower left-hand side, we can see the organic rich soil deposits that are extracted from these ecosystems. On the lower right-hand side, we see the carbon burial rate is higher for mangroves, salt marshes, and seagrasses in comparison to terrestrial tropical forests. The South African coastline has high wave energy. This means that blue carbon ecosystems are restricted to occurring in sheltered estuarine areas. Our coast is also divided into 4 biogeographic regions: the tropical and subtropical east coast, the warm temperate south coast, and the cool temperate west coast. And this determines where the different blue carbon ecosystems can occur. Blue carbon ecosystems are distributed over the 4 biogeographic regions of South Africa. The largest areas are found within the cool temperate bioregion, and this is because of the contribution of salt marshes. Mangroves occur only from the warm temperate to subtropical and tropical regions, while seagrasses and submerged macrophytes cover much smaller area. There's approximately 20,000 hectares of blue carbon ecosystems found in South Africa. Blue carbon ecosystems provide many ecosystem services, and these are the benefits that people derive from these ecosystems. Ecosystem services can be in the form of provisioning, supporting, cultural, or regulating services. Climate change mitigation and adaptation from blue carbon ecosystems are related to regulating services. It's important to remember that protection and management of blue carbon ecosystems should be holistic so that it can deliver on all ecosystem services. How do blue carbon ecosystems contribute towards climate change mitigation? These ecosystems cover a relatively small area globally, but at national scales, they can contribute towards mitigating emissions. And this is because their local carbon sequestration rate is high in relation to the area that they cover, if we consider the figure on the left. Blue carbon ecosystems therefore present opportunities for climate change mitigation aligned with the Paris Agreement and nationally determined contributions. At the global scale, if half the annual loss of coastal wetlands was halted, this would reduce emissions by 0.23 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year. Restoration to the 1990 extent could offset the burning of 77.4 million tons of coal. Blue carbon ecosystems deliver on climate change adaptation directly by protecting developed areas from sea level rise, storm surges, and river floods. In this example, we see the salt marsh acting as a buffer between properties and the estuary at Knysna. What do we know about blue carbon in South Africa? The first comprehensive studies to quantify blue carbon in South African estuaries were carried out between 2017 and 2019 as part of a WRC-funded project. Detailed carbon stock assessments and monitoring the responses to sea level rise were measured at the Knysna, Swartkops, Nahoon, and Kleinhill estuaries. Following on from this study, we're able to extrapolate blue carbon storage nationally. The largest carbon stocks are located within salt marshes of the warm-temperate and cool-temperate bioregions, and this is because this ecosystem is the most extensive. Mangroves in the subtropical bioregion also make a considerable contribution towards carbon stock, and this is because mangroves can store more carbon per unit area in comparison to salt marshes and submerged macrophytes. Overall, the submerged macrophytes make the smallest contribution across all bioregions. Despite the importance of blue carbon ecosystems, they face a number of pressures. These pressures are from direct anthropogenic activities, indicated here in the gray, as well as from climate change factors, indicated here in the purple. As these ecosystems occur within the coastal zone, they have historically been lost due to development and land use change. Degradation and destruction of blue carbon ecosystems releases the stored carbon as CO2 emissions. Therefore, losing blue carbon ecosystems reduces the adaptation capacity and resilience of the coast to respond to climate change impacts. Reducing anthropogenic pressures on blue carbon ecosystems can improve ecological health, reverse degradation, and prevent further loss of habitat. There were specific key pressures for these ecosystems that were identified in the 2018 National Biodiversity Assessment. These include land use change, reduced freshwater inflow or flow modification, reduced water quality or eutrophication, and artificial breaching. Actions and opportunities for climate change mitigation are therefore linked to reducing these pressures, as this will maintain or increase carbon storage and sequestration, and therefore reduce sources of emissions occurring from habitat loss and enhancing carbon sinks. Considering the trajectory of emissions and removals from South African blue carbon systems, we can see the historical trend of emissions and removals over time. The net emissions represent the sum of all emissions and removals for a specific time period. Here we also see the contribution of different activities to those trends. The largest emissions have occurred prior to 1990 and particularly between 1951 to 1970. The largest source of emissions has been due to extraction activities, where these represent occasions where blue carbon ecosystems were completely removed and replaced with hard developments or infrastructure. The large removals between 1971 and 1990 are the result of mangrove expansion at Mhlathu's estuary. If we consider the historical emissions and removals and then project what is expected under a business as usual model, we see that there is an increase in emissions projected from 2020 to 2050, and this is associated with the effect of ongoing pressures on these ecosystems. Besides the impact of reducing these pressures, it is also possible to carry out active restoration to enhance the carbon sink capacity of blue carbon ecosystems. The projected removals associated with active restoration have the potential to offset some of these projected emissions going forward from 2020 to 2050. In summary, the potential CO2 removals from active restoration are estimated at approximately 57,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent by 2050, and this can be achieved through the restoration of 1,160 hectares of blue carbon ecosystems, with a contribution of 100 hectares of mangrove, 1,000 hectares of salt marsh, and 60 hectares of submerged macrophytes or seagrasses. These areas that are suitable for restoration include 25% of fallow agricultural lands and 50% of abandoned salt extraction pans and degraded blue carbon ecosystems. And these have been identified from existing spatial data sets, so these targets are expected to be realistic but conservative. If we consider next the potential for blue carbon ecosystems to provide resilience to climate change adaptation, we must first recall that mangroves and salt marshes are structured by their position in the tidal frame, where different plant species occur within different zones depending on the amount of inundation that they can withstand. There are therefore two responses of these ecosystems to sea level rise. The first one being surface elevation gain, where the ecosystem accumulates sediment and organic matter at a rate that is equal to sea level rise. In this way, the vegetation can maintain its optimal position within the tidal frame. The other alternative is landward migration, whereas with sea level rise, the ecosystem successively moves landward in order to maintain a suitable position within the tidal frame. We have been measuring these responses to sea level rise in blue carbon ecosystems of South Africa, and this was carried out as part of the same WRC project and in collaboration with SAON. There are currently 5 monitoring sites for blue carbon ecosystem responses to sea level rise, and these are at the Knysna, Krom, Swartkops, Nahoon, and Glenhill estuaries. The next step is to go from measuring responses to modeling the potential for these ecosystems to contribute towards climate change adaptation. Currently, this is only possible to carry out at the scale of individual estuaries, and this is because a national high-resolution digital elevation model is needed for larger scale assessments. So far, studies that show the responses of sea level rise are variable both within and between estuaries. However, overall there is going to be a need for land use planning to account for migration and to promote active retreat of developed areas. This is because, in most cases, the surface elevation gain rate is not going to be fast enough to cope with sea level rise. The blue carbon ecosystems therefore need space with which they can move back into and therefore continue to provide resilience against sea level rise. Therefore, preventing the further degradation, undertaking restoration, and allowing for landward migration will secure the blue carbon ecosystems in South Africa. This will reduce CO2 emissions and enhance carbon sequestration, and can therefore be leveraged towards national strategies for emissions reductions and offsetting, and this will contribute directly towards climate change mitigation adaptation. This research is currently being carried out as part of a project with the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, funded by the GIZ. In conclusion, there are opportunities to include blue carbon ecosystems in both climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies. Although blue carbon ecosystems cover relatively small areas, the carbon storage and sequestration potential is high, significantly enhancing carbon sink capacity to contribute towards mitigation is only possible through active restoration. It is also therefore critical that the current extent of these ecosystems is maintained, as habitat loss leads to large emissions of CO2 that can't be regained over short time frames. Blue carbon ecosystems also provide protection against sea level rise, storm surges, flooding, and erosion, but these ecosystems can also be vulnerable to these threats. The potential for landward migration and preventing coastal squeeze must be available for these ecosystems so that they can continue to provide resilience as an ecosystem service. We would like to acknowledge the following funding and collaborating organizations for supporting this research. We also thank everyone who has been involved in this project along the way. Thank you for listening to this presentation, and if you would like to follow updates on our project, please follow us on the various social media platforms. Thank you.